well, I best get cracking. Now this is a very simple design that I did with lots of repetitive cuts that anyone can do with simple tools. I'll give some tips as I go along, and you can find a set of plans and a cut list in a link below. Anyway, I'm starting to cut the side pieces. This is good quality pine. Then I wanted to set a stop block up to cut some dowels, and I'm marking mine to cut them in half. If you're using a miter saw, keep it as steady as you can to stop it spinning. You don't want kickback, but a handsaw is perfectly fine for this because we'll trim it down later. Now here's a top tip. Look at broom handles. You'll find them quite a bit cheaper than regular dowels. Next, I've got my side pieces all laid out, then making references of which I want to be the bottoms and the tops. And I'm carefully marking the positions of the centre of my dowel pieces. After using an engineer's square, I'd line the next one up and mark that as well. But because I had so many and I needed to keep them lined up all the time, it was actually just as quick to do each one individually. And to get centre point of the dowel, I'd set up a mini combination square. This backhoe one's got no wobble in it, and I'd mark it from either side and then mark central of that. But before I drilled the holes for my dowels, I'm pre-drilling first on a drill press, then I could later come back with my flat wood drill bit and use that hole as a reference. And I drill over halfway, flip it over and continue to reduce any tear out. But actually this was such a slow process. Every time I pushed it down, it kept stopping. So I decided to take them to my vise and put the hole saw in my combi drill. And I'll tell you why later I found this much more beneficial. It flew through it. And a quick hand sand of any of the slight splinters before I move on to the next stage. Now if you've got time, I highly recommend routering any of the edges now before you start gluing it all together. But I had to be quick here, so I dealt with that later. Now do you remember when I said the dowels will be cut down later? Well, I used an offcut to trap between the sides. You could use whatever size you want, and this allowed the dowels to poke through slightly. Put the dowel back in, use the offcut as a spacer, and another offcut at the top end to make sure it was all level. And I'd fix it in place with my finishing nailer, or you could just hammer in tiny tack nails. And the difference between using a flat wood drill bit in a combi drill and a drill press, the drill press was more accurate, don't get me wrong, but it made it really hard work to hammer them in. So I preferred a little bit of wiggle room with the combi drill method so I could glue up, put it in, particularly when you're in a rush and it's a very hot day. You will, however, need to fill any slight gaps with some glue later. To make sure it was really sturdy, I put 2 nails per dowel on either side and wipe away any of the glue drips. And it was rinse and repeat 3 times. Or you could just make 2 sections, and because I'd nailed them in, it meant I could crack on sooner with my flush trim saw and remove the excess of the dowels. So after leaving that to dry overnight, it's a mess. I needed to do some finishing touches. I mixed a quick set filler and filled any of the nail holes. I prefer this stuff because it takes about 30 minutes to set. So while I waited, I could then start adding glue to any of the slight spaces around the dowels and go over with an orbital sander. Now if you've not routed it already, this time instead of my favourite 45-degree chamfer router bit, I decided, shock horror, to go for a round over bit. I suppose it matches the dowels. And the quickest method I found for this was clamping the centre of it onto my sawhorse so I could use it as a seesaw horse. Flip it over and do the same on the other side. And a quick hand sand on the sides where I couldn't get with my router, and then treat it. Although I couldn't totally decide on what I was going to use because obviously clothes is going to go on this. And I went for teak oil because I've got it. It's water repellent. It's going to be in the conservatory, so it should protect it under any extreme heat. But you'll probably have to leave it about 2 weeks to fully dry before you start using it. The broom handles already have varnish on it, but I quite like the contrast, so I'm leaving it as it is. Hinges. Let's talk about fitting hinges. I decided to use some packers to space them slightly apart so I knew I could always close them, even if they expanded and contracted. And I positioned the bottom one just underneath the bottom dowels, marked with a sharp pencil, then punctured with an automatic centre punch. I'll leave links to things I'm using below. Should have said that sooner. And then drilled with a 2mm drill bit and popped a couple of screws in initially, and did the same with the top one and do a quick test before I knew I was okay to put them all in. Although when I screwed them on, I made sure that the torque settings were the lowest they could be. I don't want these ripping out. And because it's going to be a zigzag design, I flipped it over, clamped them all again, so I could put the last 2 hinges on. Anyway, this may be overbuilt, but I know that once we put a whole load on, it's not going to collapse. Still got the sawdust on. And if you want a dedicated place to put it, then you really should watch this playlist here on how I built a utility kitchen.